Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of antebellum Louisiana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this narration. In the spring of 1842, Dr. Elias Jackson arrived at Magnolia Hill Plantation outside New Orleans with his Harvard credentials and gleaming surgical instruments. Claiming to seek medical advancements, the respected physician converted an old carriage house into a laboratory where horrors occurred behind locked doors. Over 17 months, 23 enslaved individuals disappeared inside, their screams echoing across cotton fields at night. When authorities investigated in December 1843, they discovered journals documenting methodical experiments performed without anesthesia on fully conscious human beings. Most disturbing were Jackson's notes describing his subjects as physiologically distinct specimens requiring specialized research methods. These atrocities remained sealed in court documents until 2018. Colonel James Beaumont's meticulous plantation records, preserved in the Louisiana Historical Society archives, document Dr. Jackson's arrival on April 17, 1842. Noting his distinguished bearing and impeccable recommendations from the finest medical institutions of the North. A series of letters between Beaumont and Jackson, discovered during a 2020 renovation of the plantation's former study, reveal the physician's careful cultivation of his prestigious image. Harvard Medical School graduate of 1835, former apprentice to the renowned Philadelphia surgeon Dr. William Gibson, and contributor to the controversial American Journal of Medical Peculiarities, where his papers on inherent physiological variations between racial specimens had drawn both acclaim and quiet concern among his peers. Jackson's correspondence, written in flowing script on expensive parchment, conveyed authority and scientific detachment that impressed the plantation owner, himself a self-styled patron of scientific progress, who had previously welcomed geologists and botanists to study his vast property. Most revealing was a letter discovered in 2019 among the personal effects of Dr. Henry Watkins of Boston, in which Jackson confided his true purpose at Magnolia Hill. The constraints of northern moral interference have hampered true medical advancement for too long. Here I shall have unrestricted access to specimens whose suffering, while regrettable, serves a higher scientific purpose: the establishment of definitive physiological categorization of the races, work that will transform medical understanding for generations to come. The transformation of the old carriage house into Dr. Jackson's laboratory, meticulously documented in the Beaumont Plantation expense ledgers discovered in a forgotten trunk in the Louisiana State Archives in 2019, began within days of the physician's arrival at Magnolia Hill. Architectural plans, sketched by Jackson himself on imported vellum and annotated with cryptic Latin terminology, revealed an elaborate conversion that far exceeded typical medical facilities of the era. The original timber frame reinforced with brick and stone, windows reduced to narrow slits covered with iron lattice work, and interior walls reconstructed to create interconnected chambers arranged in what Jackson termed a logical progression of investigative intensity. Colonel Beaumont's private journal, recovered from his great-granddaughter's estate in 2022, revealed growing concern about the physician's increasingly specific demands. Dr. J has requested materials I find most peculiar: wool batting and lead sheeting for the walls, which he claims will contain sound for privacy of consultation, though I question what consultations might require such extensive soundproofing. Most disturbing were the entries from June 1842, where Beaumont questioned invoices for specialized restraint mechanisms that Jackson insisted were merely advanced examination tables with necessary securements for patient stability during delicate procedures, and the elaborate drainage system installed beneath the wooden floors, channels lined with copper that converged toward a central reservoir that could be flushed into the nearby bayou. Archaeological excavations conducted by Tulane University in 2020 uncovered evidence challenging the official timeline. Beneath the foundation stones, in a layer of soil predating recorded construction. Researchers discovered surgical implements with human blood traces and bone fragments bearing distinctive cut marks consistent with dissection, suggesting Jackson had begun his experimental work in secret before the Ann. Laboratory's completion. Carbon dating placed these remains within weeks of Jackson's arrival, contradicting his correspondence which claimed his first medical investigations began in August 1842. After Colonel Beaumont's cursory tour of what he described as an impressive temple to modern medical science, though certain rooms remained locked, ostensibly to protect delicate equipment from contamination. The first documented disappearances from Magnolia Hill Plantation occurred in late August 1842, when 3 enslaved men, Solomon, aged 27, Isaiah, aged 31, and Jeremiah, aged 24, vanished from the field quarters within a single week, their names appearing in Dr. Jackson's meticulous acquisition ledger with notations describing them as exceptional physical specimens suitable for preliminary comparative studies. Plantation records, later subpoenaed during the 1843 investigation, revealed Colonel Beaumont had approved their transfer to medical service, following Jackson's request for subjects possessing particular anatomical proportions and robust constitution necessary for endurance of extended examination. The profound terror that swept through the enslaved community following these initial disappearances emerged decades later through the Federal Writers Project, when in 1937, a formerly enslaved woman named Sarah Jenkins, who had served as a house servant at Magnolia Hill, provided testimony that historians would only fully appreciate after the case files were unsealed in 2018. Folks knew when the doctor came looking, you wouldn't see that person no more, except sometimes at night we'd hear the screaming from that old carriage house. And the overseers would tell us it was just injured animals being treated, but we knew whose voices those were. Those men didn't die quick. They died slow over days and weeks. Jackson's laboratory journal, bound in calfskin with his monogram embossed in gold and recovered from the sealed court evidence in 2018, provided horrifying confirmation of Sarah's account, the elegant script and precise medical terminology contrasting grotesquely with the content of his entries. Subject 1 Solomon demonstrates fascinating thoracic cavity variations when examined while in conscious state. The exposure of the living lung tissue during controlled respiration offers unprecedented opportunity to observe pulmonary function in its natural state, though subjects' vocalizations proved distracting until partial laryngeal restriction was implemented. Subsequent entries documented weeks of systematic experimentation on each man, with clinical observations about pain thresholds, tissue regenerative properties, and cardiovascular responses to stimuli applied to exposed organs, before concluding with dispassionate notations regarding terminal outcomes following complete thoracic dissection and instructions for the preservation of specified organs and tissue samples for his growing comparative collection of racial anatomical specimens. The research journals of Dr. Elias Jackson, comprising 7 leather-bound volumes recovered from the sealed court evidence and meticulously transcribed by archivists in 2019, reveal a methodological approach to human experimentation that modern medical historians have described as systematized torture under the guise of scientific inquiry. Each experiment followed a precise protocol, beginning with detailed anatomical measurements and baseline physiological observations of the subjects, identified only by numbers and occasional references to their plantation names, followed by what Jackson termed graduated stimuli application to document pain thresholds across different tissue types and organ systems. His entries, written in a flowing script with scientific terminology interspersed with Latin phrases, detailed procedures that defy modern ethical comprehension. Subject 7 demonstrates extraordinary pulmonary elasticity when chest cavity is exposed without anesthesia. The conscious observation of breathing mechanics provides unprecedented insight, impossible to achieve in post-mortem examination. Particularly disturbing are Jackson's extensive notes on what he termed physiological stress adaptations, wherein he documented the body's responses to prolonged pain, sleep deprivation, controlled blood loss, and deliberate infection with various pathogens. Recording with scientific precision the changes in pulse, respiration, pupillary response, and involuntary muscular contractions. A comprehensive medical review conducted by historians and physicians from Johns Hopkins University in 2021 confirmed that beneath the horror of Jackson's methods lay genuine scientific observation. His detailed recordings of cardiovascular responses to trauma, infection progression, and neurological reactions demonstrated an advanced understanding of human physiology for his era, with several observations predating officially recognized medical discoveries by decades. Dr. Miranda Chen, lead researcher of the Johns Hopkins Review, noted, "What makes Jackson's work so disturbing is not merely its cruelty, but the precision of his observations. He was documenting genuine physiological phenomena while completely disregarding the humanity of his subjects, representing perhaps the most extreme example of the false dichotomy between scientific progress and ethical consideration in medical history." Most chilling were Jackson's reflections on his subjects' psychological deterioration, noting with clinical detachment how individuals progressed from initial resistance and vocalization through stages of bargaining behavior, resignation, and finally, transcendent detachment from sensory input, a state he described as the final separation of consciousness from bodily awareness that occurred shortly before death. Among Jackson's extensive catalog of victims, none featured more prominently in his later journals than Rebecca, a young enslaved woman whose acquisition in November 1842 was documented in Colonel Beaumont's ledgers with the unusual notation, "literate female, age approximately 20. Unusually educated through previous owner's indulgence, potentially problematic property requiring disciplinary management." Rebecca's presence in the laboratory marked a significant shift in Jackson's NES research focus, as evidenced by the sudden proliferation of entries devoted to what he termed anomalous neurological resistance patterns observed during his procedures. According to his meticulous documentation, Rebecca demonstrated an unprecedented physiological response to extreme pain, a capacity to maintain consciousness and even cognitive function during procedures that had rendered previous subjects catatonic or caused immediate cardiovascular collapse. Jackson's fascination with this phenomenon bordered on obsession, his typically measured scientific prose giving way to increasingly frantic observations. Subject R maintains extraordinary neural regulation, despite extensive stimulation of typically unbearable intensity. Her capacity to dissociate sensory input from cognitive response suggests a physiological adaptation I have not previously documented in any racial category. Archaeological excavations conducted at the former laboratory site in 2022 uncovered a grim confirmation of the extent of Jackson's fixation, a cache of sealed glass containers preserved in alcohol solutions, each meticulously labeled with dates and anatomical classifications, containing tissue samples of what DNA analysis later confirmed to be segments of a female nervous system, primarily sections of spinal cord and peripheral nerve clusters. Specialized scanning techniques revealed microscopic dissection patterns consistent with techniques documented in Jackson's research journals, where he described methodically tracing neural pathways while Rebecca remained conscious, attempting to identify the physiological basis of her resistance. The journals documented her repeated statements that her grandmother, a healer from Saint-Domingue, had taught her to separate spirit from flesh during pain, a cultural practice Jackson dismissed as superstition, while paradoxically acknowledging its measurable physiological manifestations. Most disturbing was his final notation regarding Rebecca, dated October 1843. Subject R continues to defy complete neurological mapping despite extensive exploration. Recommend comprehensive central nervous system extraction for detailed laboratory analysis, a procedure that modern medical historians confirm would have been impossible to survive. The extent of Colonel James Beaumont's complicity in Dr. Jackson's atrocities emerged through a cache of private correspondence discovered in 2019 during renovation of the Beaumont family's New Orleans townhouse, revealing a gradual transformation from ignorant enabler to knowing beneficiary of medical torture. Early letters to business associates in Charleston and Philadelphia, dated summer 1842, describe Jackson's work with genuine enthusiasm as revolutionary medical research that shall bring scientific distinction to Magnolia Hill, suggesting Beaumont initially believed the physician's cover. This facade crumbled by late autumn, as evidenced in Beaumont's increasingly troubled journal entries, which acknowledged disturbing sounds emanating from the laboratory during evening hours and troubling rumors among the field hands regarding the fate of those selected for the doctor's service. Financial ledgers recovered from the Bank of Louisiana revealed the probable catalyst for Beaumont's continued accommodation of Jackson despite growing awareness. Beginning in December 1842, substantial quarterly deposits appeared in Beaumont's accounts from a shell company, later identified as a front for what Jackson called the Physiological Advancement Consortium, with annotations indicating compensation for research accommodation and specimen procurement. Most revealing was a letter Beaumont wrote to his wife Marguerite, who resided primarily at their New Orleans residence and had expressed concerns about rumors reaching the city. "I cannot deny that the sounds from the old carriage house haunt my sleep, my dear. Nor can I pretend complete ignorance of their source. Yet I implore you to understand our financial circumstances. Leave little room for moral luxury. The creditors press ever closer, and the doctor's benefactors offer sums that may yet preserve our children's inheritance and the Beaumont legacy." Subsequent correspondence showed Beaumont's gradual self-justification, as he began referencing necessary sacrifices in service to scientific progress and the advancement of medical knowledge through means that, while regrettable, shall ultimately benefit mankind. Rationalizations that allowed him to continue approving Jackson's requests for fresh research subjects, while the payments swelled his recovering accounts and paid down the scion debts that had threatened the plantation's solvency. The clandestine network of communication that existed among enslaved communities throughout Louisiana's plantation country, a system of information exchange that slaveholders consistently underestimated, became the primary vector through which knowledge of Dr. Jackson's horrific experiments spread beyond the boundaries of Magnolia Hill. Oral histories collected during the Federal Writers Project in the 1,930 seconds, particularly interviews conducted with elderly, formerly enslaved people from neighboring plantations, revealed how warnings about the doctor who steals people for his cutting work traveled via trusted messengers, laundresses who visited multiple properties, enslaved blacksmiths whose skills were borrowed between plantations, and riverboatmen who transported goods along the Mississippi. One account, provided by Moses Carter, who had been enslaved on the adjoining Willow Creek plantation, described how word passed through the quarters that if you saw a tall man with spectacles coming with the overseer, you best find way to look sickly or injured, for he only took the strongest for his devil's work, and none who went ever returned to tell what happened in that carriage house. Documentary evidence supporting these oral histories emerged in a journal kept by Thomas Wilkinson, overseer of the Greenwood plantation located 3 miles from Magnolia Hill, discovered in a private collection in 2016. Entries from early 1843 noted with increasing frustration unusual resistance among the field hands to medical examinations and unprecedented flight attempts despite harsh consequences. 4 runaways this month alone, all coinciding with visits from neighboring physician. Jackson's awareness of this information network appeared in his own records through ominous notations regarding troubling evidence of information leakage, regarding research protocols, and increasingly paranoid demands to Colonel Beaumont for enhanced security measures. Laboratory perimeter must be patrolled during nighttime procedures. Subjects' vocalizations apparently carrying further than anticipated despite soundproofing efforts. By spring 1843, Jackson's journals documented the construction of a secondary fence around the laboratory with glass shards embedded in its top, the implementation of a rotating patrol schedule utilizing the plantation's most trusted overseers, and the institution of what he termed information containment protocols, wherein subjects were now kept isolated from the general enslaved population for several weeks before being transferred to the laboratory, ostensibly for quarantine purposes but clearly designed to prevent forewarning of their fate, measures that revealed his growing concern about potential interference with his research as awareness of his activities spread throughout the region. Among the most disturbing revelations following the unsealing of the Jackson case files in 2018 was the discovery of a collection of correspondence written in an elaborate cipher, letters exchanged between Jackson and an elaborate cipher organization identifying itself as the Physiological Advancement Consortium, purportedly headquartered in Charleston but with connections extending throughout major southern cities and, most disturbingly, to certain prestigious northern medical institutions. These documents, which had confounded 19th-century investigators due to their impenetrable encryption, were finally deciphered in 2020 by cryptographers from the National Security Agency, working in conjunction with medical historians, revealing an extensive network of physicians engaged in what they euphemistically termed unfettered anatomical research on living specimens. The decoded messages exposed a chilling reality. Jackson was neither way, working in isolation nor operating without institutional support, but rather functioned as a field researcher for a well-funded medical cabal dedicated to establishing scientific proof of racial physiological hierarchies through experimental methods too horrific to be conducted openly. Financial records embedded within the coded correspondence showed quarterly disbursements to Jackson totaling over $30,000 between 1,842 and 1,843, equivalent to nearly $1 million in contemporary valuation, with annotations regarding exemplary productivity and unprecedented data collection efficiency. Most disturbing were the detailed requests from consortium members for specific tissue specimens preserved. According to Protocol 17 and comprehensive procedural documentation regarding cardiovascular stress responses, with explicit instructions for routing these materials through a series of intermediate locations, disguised as legitimate medical supply shipments before reaching their final destinations, including medical school anatomy collections in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York. The consortium's communications revealed sophisticated precautions to maintain secrecy, including rotating ciphers, coded identities for all members. Jackson was referred to only as Researcher Delta, and contingency protocols in case of exposure that included provisions for rapid evidence disposal and subject elimination if recovery appears imminent. Particularly disturbing was correspondence dated March 1843, praising Jackson's work on the exceptional female subject with anomalous pain resistance, requesting comprehensive central nervous system specimens with particular attention to spinal ganglion structures, and suggesting that similar physiological anomalies have been documented by researcher Epsilon in Manning, Virginia, suggesting a potentially inheritable trait worthy of comprehensive investigation across multiple generations. The most significant challenge to Dr. Jackson's nightmarish enterprise occurred in the early hours of September 7, 1843, when 5 enslaved individuals, Rebecca, whose neurological resilience had become the focus of Jackson's obsession, along with 2 men scheduled for cardiovascular studies and 2 women recently selected from the field quarters, attempted a desperate escape from Magnolia Hill Plantation, an event documented in the overseer's punishment ledger with the terse notation, 5 runaways, all recovered within 36 hours, standard correction administered publicly as deterrent. The local newspaper, the Louisiana Courier, published a brief account on September 10th, describing the capture and punishment of 5 ungrateful slaves who fled from the benevolent plantation of Colonel Beaumont, receiving due justice through 20 lashes each before the assembled workers as moral instruction against such ingratitude. The article notably omitting any connection between these individuals and Dr. Jackson's research facility. The physician's private journals, however, revealed his fury at this interruption to his work, particularly regarding Rebecca. Subject R's attempted flight represents incalculable potential loss to scientific advancement. Her unusual neurological architecture remains incompletely mapped, despite 6 separate exploratory procedures. Most disturbing was his clinical assessment following the public punishment. Subject R sustained significant dermal and subcutaneous trauma during disciplinary action, compromising planned nervous system extraction, have instructed overseer that valuable research subjects must be exempt from standard corporal punishment protocols in future. Plantation medical records indicated that 2 of the escapees, including a man identified only as Thomas, died within days of their punishment, though the official death certificate for Thomas, discovered in Louisiana State Archives in 2021, listed his cause of death as complications following medical procedure, rather than the consequences of the severe whipping described in multiple witness accounts collected years later. A letter from Jackson to the consortium, dated September 12, revealed the true fate of the survivors. Despite regrettable damage to external specimens, internal structures remain viable for continued investigation, have implemented enhanced security protocols, including individual ankle shackling and continuous observation for remaining high-value subjects. Escape attempt, while ultimately unsuccessful, left a critical documentary trail that would later provide investigators with proof of the connection between the laboratory and the disappearances that had terrorized the enslaved community of Magnolia Hill for over a year. The official investigation that ultimately exposed Dr. Jackson's atrocities began through seemingly mundane circumstances on December 3, 1843, when Edmund Pickering, a clerk accompanying Magistrate William Harding, on a routine administrative visit to update Magnolia Hill's property tax assessments, noticed alarming discrepancies while reviewing the plantation's legally required mortality records. The documented deaths among the enslaved population had increased by nearly 300% since Jackson's arrival. Yet no disease outbreak had been reported to health authorities as required by Louisiana statute. Court documents later revealed Magistrate Harding's initial reluctance to pursue these irregularities, noting in his private correspondence to the parish sheriff that Colonel Beaumont's standing in our community and generous contributions to the governor's recent campaign suggest administrative discretion might be warranted. However, Pickering, troubled by rumors he had heard from his own domestic servant about the doctor who butchers people alive, persuaded Harding to conduct a cursory inspection of the laboratory facility on December 7. The magistrate's official report, sealed until 2018, described their discovery in language uncharacteristically emotional for a legal document. Upon entering the rear chambers of the structure, we encountered a chamber of horrors that defies Christian description. Living subjects restrained upon tables with portions of their anatomy exposed while fully conscious, preserved human organs arranged in labeled specimen jars, and detailed illustrations of procedures so grotesque as to suggest methods of torture rather than medical investigation. Jackson's arrest record, filed the same day, documented his extraordinary response when confronted with the evidence of his crimes. Rather than denying the nature of his activities, he defended them with academic indignation as essential medical research criminally interrupted by laymen incapable of comprehending its scientific significance. As authorities cataloged evidence for prosecution, including 17 living victims in various states of vivisection, over 200 preserved human specimens, and Jackson's extensive research journals, they discovered dedicated correspondence files revealing the physician's connections to medical institutions throughout the country, prompting the parish judge to order all case materials sealed under judicial authority due to potentially inflammatory implications regarding respected persons and establishments beyond our jurisdiction. The subsequent inventory required 3 full days to complete and filled 27 pages with descriptions that caused one deputy to resign his position immediately after the assignment, declaring himself unwilling to continue in a profession that had exposed him to such evidence of mankind's capacity for methodical cruelty disguised as intellectual pursuit. The trial of Dr. Elias Jackson, which legal historians have subsequently characterized as a masterclass in judicial manipulation, commenced on January 15, 1844, in a closed courtroom with proceedings heavily influenced by the considerable political connections of Colonel Beaumont, whose family's relationships with Louisiana's governing elite stretched back 3 generations. Court transcripts, partially recovered from damaged archives in 2018, reveal an abbreviated judicial process wherein Jackson's defense attorney, Bartholomew Winters, successfully argued for his client's classification as a brilliant medical mind overcome by scientific monomania rather than criminal intent, a legal strategy that shifted the proceedings from criminal prosecution to competency evaluation. Medical testimony from 3 physicians, all subsequently discovered to have correspondence connections with the mysterious Physiological Advancement Consortium, unanimously declared Jackson a practitioner of extraordinary talent, suffering acute scientific obsession rendering him temporarily insensible to moral boundaries. The judge's ruling, issued after merely 6 days of testimony compared to the typical 3 weeks for capital cases, ordered Jackson's indefinite commitment to Whitefield Sanitarium, an exclusive private asylum in Virginia known for its discretion and comfortable accommodations for wealthy patients. Parish records documented the immediate aftermath. The laboratory structure was burned to the ground by order of local authorities on January 23, 1844, ostensibly as a public health measure but effectively destroying considerable physical evidence. Plantation sale records revealed Beaumont's systematic dismantling of potential witness testimony through the rapid sale of all surviving victims and other enslaved people with knowledge of the experiments, transactions dispersing them to distant plantations throughout Louisiana, Mississippi, and Georgia, with sale documents specifically prohibiting their return to the parish. The final chapter of Colonel Beaumont's involvement emerged through estate records filed in October 1845, documenting his financial collapse and subsequent suicide through laudanum overdose, with no mention of Jackson's experiments but revealing systematic withdrawal of the substantial consortium funding following the exposure, leading to rapid insolvency as Beaumont's creditors simultaneously called in the plantation's considerable debts. The extraordinary legal mechanisms employed to seal all records related to Jackson's case emerged through historical analysis conducted after the document's release in 2018, revealing an unprecedented judicial suppression orchestrated at the highest levels of both Louisiana governance and national medical establishments. Parish court records documented an unusual judicial decree issued on February 7, 1844, classifying all materials related to the medical investigations of Dr. E. Jackson as potentially inflammatory to public morality and detrimental to social order, thereby mandating their complete removal from public access for a period initially set at 75 years, but extended twice through subsequent legal maneuvers to reach the remarkable total of 175 years. The public justification for this extraordinary measure, as reported in the sanitized newspaper accounts permitted to circulate, centered on protecting community sensibilities from details of medical procedures too disturbing for general knowledge. However, a private diary discovered in 2015 the attic of Samuel Whitfield, chief clerk to Judge Harrison, who presided over the sealing process, revealed a far more calculated purpose. Whitfield's journal entries from February 1844 described intense pressure applied through a series of meetings with representatives from certain northern medical schools whose financial contributions to our regional institutions have suddenly become contingent upon the permanent securing of all documentation regarding Jackson's research and its supporting network. Most revealing was Whitfield's entry dated February 12th. Judge H. received another communication from Philadelphia Today. The threat is explicit that should any materials implicating the sponsoring institutions become public, consequences would extend beyond mere financial repercussions to personal ruination of all officials involved in the case. The governor himself has now interceded to ensure complete compliance. Legal historians examining the sealing protocols implemented for the Jackson materials have noted their exceptional thoroughness, including provisions for periodic inspection by designated judicial officers sworn to secrecy, restrictions preventing even acknowledgement of the record's existence in official catalogues, and the extraordinary requirement that any official seeking access must receive written authorization from both the state's Attorney General and the President of the Louisiana Medical Society, AZ, a dual approval system. Unprecedented in American jurisprudence, and clearly designed to ensure that individuals with potential connections to the implicated medical establishments maintained control over access in perpetuity, suggesting a conspiracy of silence, extending far beyond Louisiana's borders to protect institutions whose reputations and endowments had been built, at least partially, upon knowledge derived from Jackson's atrocities. Despite the official suppression of Jackson's name and the sealing of his case records, disturbing elements of his research quietly infiltrated mainstream medical education through a network of colleagues who had received his findings prior to his arrest, creating a shadowy legacy that would influence medical perspectives on race for generations to come. Medical textbooks published between 1850 and 1890, particularly those focused on surgical techniques and anatomical variations, contain numerous references to observations regarding racial physiological distinctions attributed to anonymous Southern medical researchers, or cited simply as recent anatomical discoveries. Descriptions that, when compared with Jackson's unsealed journals in 2018, reveal unmistakable similarities in terminology, specific measurements, and purported racial differences in organ structures and nervous system arrangements. The prestigious Hemphill's Comprehensive Anatomy, published in 1867 and used in medical schools throughout America until the early 20th century, contains an entire chapter on comparative racial physiology, featuring illustrations nearly identical to Jackson's laboratory sketches, including his distinctive error regarding pulmonary vascular arrangements that no legitimate researcher would have independently replicated. Most consequential was the publication of Observations on Sensory Response Variations in Different Racial Categories by Dr. William Cartwright in 1851, which introduced the concept of diminished pain sensitivity among Negro subjects, a paper now proven through correspondence records to have been directly based on Jackson's experiments on Rebecca and other victims, yet accepted as legitimate medical observation, and subsequently cited in over 40 medical texts between 1855 and 1920. A comprehensive analysis published by medical historian Dr. Jasmine Reynolds in 2019 traced these publications through successive generations of medical literature, demonstrating how Jackson's methodologically flawed and ethically abhorrent findings became laundered into respectable medical discourse, ultimately contributing to persistent misconceptions about racial differences in pain, perception that studies have shown continue to influence medical treatment disparities in contemporary healthcare settings. Reynolds' research identified 17 prominent physicians who maintained correspondence with Jackson before his arrest and subsequently published papers incorporating his observations without attribution, including 3 who became medical school deans and 1 who served as Surgeon General during the Civil War, positions from which they quietly disseminated physiological misconceptions derived from torture, ensuring that while Jackson's name faded from public knowledge, the poisonous legacy of his work continued to shape medical education and practice well into the 20th century. The legal battle to unseal the Jackson documents, spearheaded by historian Dr. Amara Washington of Howard University between 2015 and 2018, represented an unprecedented challenge to institutional power, with court records revealing systematic opposition from unexpected quarters, not only descendants of the Beaumont family who cited potential reputational damage to uninvolved lineage members, but more significantly, legal teams representing 5 prestigious medical schools whose motions for continued suppression cited dubious concerns about historical context and professional medical heritage. Dr. Washington's persistence through 17 court hearings and 4 appeals, documented in her 2020 memoir, Unsealing Medical Atrocity, ultimately succeeded through her discovery of a procedural flaw in the 1919 extension of the sealing order that rendered subsequent extensions technically invalid, a legal technicality that finally granted researchers access to over 3,000 pages of original documentation in April 2018. The most profound discovery among these records was a thin, leather-bound journal, approximately 4 by 6 inches, hidden within a larger portfolio of evidence and catalogued simply as miscellaneous documentation, Rebecca's personal account. Written in pencil on pages torn from one of Jackson's medical reference books and secreted within her sleeping pallet, recovered during the initial investigation but subsequently buried within the sealed archives. The journal's 67 pages, preserved between archival sheets by conservators from the Smithsonian in 2019, revealed an educated voice that shattered stereotypes of enslaved literacy, with entries written in elegant prose, documenting both the daily horrors of Jackson's procedures and Rebecca's extraordinary psychological resistance techniques. I have learned to separate my consciousness from my flesh when the doctor begins his cutting, allowing my mind to retreat to memories of my grandmother's garden, while observing my body's suffering as if from a great point distance. Historians of enslaved experiences have identified Rebecca's journal as perhaps the most significant first-person account yet discovered, not only for its documentation of medical atrocities but for its revelation of complex psychological resistance strategies developed by victims, forcing a fundamental re-evaluation of historical narratives around medical tenets, experimentation, and challenging long-held assumptions about both the nature of enslaved consciousness and the unrecognized legacy of traumatic medical practices that subsequently infiltrated mainstream medicine through sanitized channels that deliberately obscured their origins in torture chambers like Jackson's laboratory. The unsealing of the Jackson documents in 2018 triggered an ongoing reckoning within medical institutions across America, with the Association of American Medical Colleges establishing the Historical Accountability Commission in 2021, specifically to investigate connections between contemporary medical collections and unethically obtained specimens, an initiative that gained urgent momentum following DNA analysis conducted at Tulane University in 2023 that positively matched tissue samples still maintained in 3 prestigious medical schools' anatomical collections to living descendants of Magnolia Hill's enslaved population. These scientific confirmations transformed abstract historical atrocities into deeply personal violations for families like the Johnsons of East Texas, whose genetic profile matched preserved neural tissue labeled exceptional female specimen R7, tissue extracted from their direct ancestor Rebecca during Jackson's experiments, yet maintained as teaching specimens for over 170 years without acknowledgement or consent. Legal proceedings initiated by 17 families seeking repatriation of ancestors' remains and financial reparations have faced institutional resistance through claims of educational public domain and historical medical commons, arguments that have prompted renewed examination of the ethical foundations of medical collections nationwide. Most disturbing has been the discovery since 2020 of similarly sealed court records in Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, and Mississippi, each containing documentation of medical experimentation on enslaved individuals during the same period as Jackson's work, with correspondence evidence suggesting coordination between these operations through the mysterious Physiological Advancement Consortium, revelations indicating that Jackson's case, rather than representing an isolated horror, constituted merely one node in a widespread network of medical atrocities whose full scope remains unknown. Perhaps most chilling is the ambiguous fate of Jackson himself. Whitefield Sanitarium records discovered in Virginia State Archives in 2022 document his release after just 3 years of confinement on September 12, 1847. Noting his complete recovery from temporary scientific overexcitement and restoration of balanced medical judgment, yet no subsequent record of his medical practice publication, or even his death has been located despite extensive research. creating the disturbing possibility that he may have resumed his experimental work elsewhere under an assumed identity, potentially continuing the horrific legacy that modern medicine is only now beginning to acknowledge. A stark reminder that the consequences of historical atrocities continue to reverberate through both institutional practices and human lives into the present day.